As a part of their 2021 virtual winter programming, the Ohio State University Extension Beef Team was privileged to host University of Kentucky livestock marketing specialist Kenny Burdine via Zoom on January 26th. During his presentation, Burdine reviewed the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the 2020 livestock markets and offered insight into the continuing impact it may have as we move through 2021 and beyond. In addition to market outlook, Dr. Burdine offered thoughts on how on-farm management decisions influence marketing outcomes, including calf value in the marketplace. Here's OSU Extension Beef Field Specialist Garth Ruff as he introduces Dr. Kenny Burdine.
I'll introduce tonight's speaker, Kenny Burdine, Associate Extension Professor in Livestock Economics for our neighbors to the south at the University of Kentucky. Kentucky Native and Livestock Producers Extension Program focuses in the areas of marketing, risk management, and general profitability. He travels extensively and delivers 40 to 60 programs each year directly for livestock producers, and his research interests are primarily focused on marketing and decision-making for beef, dairy, and forage producers. Kenny also teaches a livestock marketing class on campus for undergraduates each fall. For those of you who subscribe to our Ohio Beef Letter, more than likely, Kenny is the most cited author of articles outside of OSU Extension. We certainly appreciate his willingness to present to our Ohio beef producers here this evening. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kenny.
Thanks, Garth. I appreciate it. So thanks for the invite, certainly both to Garth and Stan. I've been looking forward to this for a while, and we bounced some ideas around about what we're going to be kind of talking about and covering. So we've got some flexibility here. I'll say this to both the Garth and Stan, stop me anytime. If something comes up, ask a question or something comes through, I'm super laid back. So I'm glad to stop and deal with things as we go. And certainly I'll be glad to stick around and ask questions as long as we want to this evening. So here's kind of the plan for, I guess, the next hour and 15 minutes before we go into questions. But I'm going to spend maybe 30 minutes or so talking specifically about the cattle market. And we'll talk about COVID impacts last year, how it impacts 2021. And then I'm going to go ahead and just kind of lay out what I like to call planning prices, which is my way of not saying a price forecast for the upcoming year. And I'll give you kind of my price expectations for calves in both spring and fall of 2021. And then we'll talk about how that's going to be affected by things that are, outside of our control, of course. But, my philosophy has always been, don't be afraid to, lay some expectations out there. I'm not afraid to be wrong. I'll give you my best guesses. And then I'm going to take a little bit of time and just kind of share some thoughts with you on some different types of operations and things I would have in the back of my mind if I were in your shoes in the year 2021. Then I'm going to focus on 3 or 4, I almost want to say short topical kind of things that are really kind of focused on cow-calf management decisions. And we'll talk about some different aspects of that. Cow size, lot size considerations, preconditioning of calves, and some basic take-home things that I think will be useful to a lot of you. So looking forward to the discussion, and I do, as I said, appreciate the invite. I've started a lot of my presentations with this slide, and the date's not wrong. I'm showing you something from January of 2020, but I want you to know that if we could rewind the clock a year ago, pre-COVID, and just look at what the expectations were for production of our 3 main meat species in 2020, this is what it would have looked like. It would have looked like 2020 was going to be the high water mark in beef production because beef cow numbers finally started to come down in 2019. And that 2019 calf crop is our 2020 beef production, and the smaller 2020 beef productions the smaller 2020 calf crop should be our 2021 beef production. That's changed some, but that's what 2020 looked like. We had a real opportunity on the pork side, with African swine fever in China, to pick up some export market share there. So there was expectation of growth in pork and a sizable growth in broilers. And about the same time last year, I could have showed you any one of numerous macroeconomic indicators. I happened to choose unemployment rate to also make the point that in addition to production and export demand, we had strong domestic demand due to pretty darn good U.S. economy. So everything lined up reasonably well, setting up for, I thought, a much better 2020 than we saw in 2019. We know the rest of the story. The other thing that COVID really, I think, forced me to do that I've not done a good job with in my career, I like talking about cattle. I just do. And I like talking about the livestock side of things. And I've really had to force myself to understand better the meat side of things. So what I'm showing you here is some data from the Livestock Market Information Center. This is Bureau of Economic Analysis data that they database for us. But I think there's some interesting things here that need to be pointed out as we start thinking about how this ultimately translates into cattle price at the farm level. So first of all, understand that all these three meats interact with each other and their prices are determined somewhat by the price of the others. So as beef producers on the webinar tonight, we benefit from higher pork and poultry prices. We just do. The higher those substitute products are, the more attractive beef prices look as substitutes. So understand that first of all. I also want you to kind of start by looking at that line there for broiler price. Now, I made some notes here as I was kind of thinking about putting this here together earlier, but if you go back to 2006 and look at prices through, my last data point here actually is November, this is monthly data, is actually November of 2020. I don't have my December 2020 retail price yet. But if you go back and look at that trend and annualize the increase in price in broilers, it's increased 1.37% a year since 2006. Which we all know really doesn't even keep up with inflation. So I make that point because I think we need to understand exactly where broilers sit on the plate. That system is set up to deliver an inexpensive protein product. And that's why we consume so much chicken at the national level. Pork is kind of your next price level. And then notice beef prices in comparison and how they move. That same exact trend that I mentioned to you, where broiler prices have increased about 1.37% annualized, going back to 2006. Beef prices increased 4.5% annualized during that same price period. So there's no question that beef is the most expensive meat of the big three that Americans eat, and that's a benefit for us most of the time. That speaks, I think, to preference, but it also makes us the most vulnerable at times too. Times when the economy is not good, when there's major changes. So understand how beef, pork, and poultry sit on the U.S. consumer plate and how that impacts some things as we kind of go forward. Enter COVID. And I'm going to really take us back to about February. So the first, I guess, that I really began thinking about the possible impacts of COVID were probably into January, maybe first week of February. And at the time, it was more concerned about how is this going to impact exports? We've got a problem. How's it going to impact U.S. exports of beef to blank country? That was kind of phase one, and that was obviously minor. We know that. Phase two was pretty big at the time, and this was really that domestic demand shock. Closures, shutdowns. Virtually all restaurants in a lot of areas is totally shut down for a period of time. A lot of layoffs. This was really occurring. So, kind of think about, mid to late March now. Okay, this is really the domestic demand impact. And then we had kind of this strange income effect that occurred. We had the initial negative income effect as we thought about layoffs and cancellations and the impact of the economy. And then obviously we had some stimulus money. We had some changes in the legislation that impacted consumer spending. And in the spring and summer, in my opinion, we kept a fair amount of buying power in the hands of consumers. And that was the decision that was made. And that really set us up for what we saw in phase three. Phase three really didn't occur until about the middle of April and kind of at its worst the first part of May. But this was the supply chain disruption. This is when plants were having to shut down, and even the ones that weren't shutting down were having to slow down as they were dealing with labor issues. And a lot of folks have referred to this as a capacity issue. I don't think it's a capacity issue. I think that's probably not the right way to say it. But it was point blank, it was a labor issue. And understand that just long run in the beef system, we're not going to have a lot of excess capacity out there. It's just expensive, and folks are not, companies are not going to invest in that. So capacity was not the problem. And I'll show you a chart in a minute that'll make that point. The problem was a labor problem. And fortunately, it lasted about 6 weeks, but we did get that back largely in play. And I was really impressed with how resilient the meat system was. At a bare minimum, though, we were in this constant state of adjustment and flux. Markets don't like uncertainty. And we had just one piece of uncertainty after another in 2020, which I think set us up for a lot of what we saw this past year. Now, here's the same slide that I opened with, but it's updated now for 2020 and 2021. And I want you to understand how things have changed, okay? The 2020 calf crop was a smaller calf crop than 2019. So holding everything else constant, beef production should be down in 2021, as that 2020 calf crop is actually going to be finished and harvested, okay? Two things have happened, though. First of all, we have pushed a lot of that 2020 production into 2021, which, folks, frankly, is still a result of that backlog that we had in the spring. It's taken some time to work through that. So we absolutely shifted some fourth quarter 2020 production into first quarter 2021. The other thing I'll mention in a little bit that I think hasn't gotten as much attention as it probably would have had it not been for COVID, we've seen a major change in feed prices. You know, we've added $1 or more to corn price since summer 2020. That tends to impact weights. So we've had some pretty high slaughter weights in the beef sector for the last, 10 months or so, but we're probably going to see those come down in 2021 simply because feed costs or feed prices are just so much higher. I mentioned pork last year, golden opportunity for pork. Unfortunately, things with COVID just didn't materialize, and we actually saw pork numbers pull back some. So we did the same thing in the shifting from fourth quarter 2020 to 2021. We're going to see a fairly small increase in pork production. And broilers are interesting. That 0.7% forecasted increase in ERS is significant because what's normal in the broiler sector is a 2 to 3% increase. If you look at broiler production, especially in the second half of 2020, a lot of indications it was a conscious decision to pull back production some. And I think that is pretty telling that that sector, which is largely integrated, is doing just that they're trying to pull back the pace of production increases somewhat for 2021. So we're wrestling with a lot of things right now that are out there. That the processing backlog from spring, we're still feeling some effects of that. I'll show you some cattle on feed numbers here in just a minute that'll kind of make that point. You know, a lot of restaurants have reopened in a lot of areas. Here in Kentucky, for example, they're reopened at reduced capacity. You know, there's been questions there, your sit-down type restaurants. You know, one anecdotal thing I know is a lot of these fast food restaurants have decided we're not going to fool with the inside, and they're just focusing on drive-through. And, you know, you cannot get inside, sit down and eat. Boy, the drive-through lines are backed up in the main road. So I've noticed that as an interesting thing at the restaurant market. And do understand that, you know, a lot of our meat, beef as well, is consumed away from home typically. So this is important. And along those same lines, to me, one of the big questions is, you know, how much of the change in consumer buying patterns are really going to stick? You know, there's people that study human behavior. I'm not one of them, but that really study how people react to things and how quickly things become habit forming. And so many of us have changed our lifestyle significantly now, and we're 10, 11 months into this. And it's going to be interesting. Our people have become more accustomed to eating at home. Are they going to be less likely to go back out and eat? Or they just have, these kind of changes to me are interesting and may have some longer term impact in the beef sector. This is beef production numbers. This goes through the end of 2020, and I wanted to do it so I could show you. So I wanted to show it this way so I could compare 2020 to 2019. So blue line there is 2020. The reason why I made the point earlier that we didn't really have a processing capacity issue in 2020, I want you to look at what was going on in the first 3 months of 2020. There is no doubt in my mind that a lot of our industry was moving very quickly to try and get ahead of COVID to some extent. And we, in fact, did build up some stocks of beef there for a period of time. This same exact thing holds for pork as well, by the way. But, you know, we were well on pace to handle, the expected increase in slaughter that we were going to see and did see, frankly, in 2020 up to this point. And then here's kind of that low water mark, that bottom. This is the first week of May. But beef production was down about 35% from 2019. And that chart to me is just almost unfathomable to think about what we saw. And now that, this first week of May was the low water mark. But again, there was about 6 weeks here where we saw some major changes. When you've got that much change in beef production, you're going to see impacts at the retail level. And this is why we saw, I don't know if shortage is the right word, but we definitely saw at a bare minimum a decrease in the variety of meat products out there. You could not get everything on your grocery list. It was hard to find ground beef sometimes. It was hard to find certain types of steak. Again, I try not to use a lot of anecdotal evidence, but it was, but it really was a neat thing to kind of watch unfold. And that, it wasn't that we could not find meat. It was that we could not really find what we wanted at times. So had probably more impact on variety and selection in a lot of places than others, but there's no question that this was something that really tested the system. But then I want you to notice, though, by the time we got into about the 1st of July, we were actually running production levels higher than 2019. And again, the system showed a lot of resiliency and really found a way to work through this and understand that they were doing this in the wake of COVID, spacing. Lines were probably moving slower, may have had to add crews, more protective equipment. So this is no small feat, and do appreciate what the industry managed to do, because the thing we needed the most is we needed to push some cattle through the system. We had to stop the backlog, and that's what we largely were able to do in the second half of 2020. This is cattle on feed numbers. This is monthly marketings. So you're kind of looking here. This is the April. Here's the May time period. Those were the 2 months that were affected in terms of marketing. And again, this was just the fact there's nowhere to go with them, or a lot fewer places to go with them. So we could not push cattle off of feed, so they kind of backed up on feed and backed up outside of feed yards as well back in the spring of the year. I thought this was telling too. I tried to go back and look at July cattle numbers overall, trying to estimate how many cattle were outside feed yards and trying to think about, okay, how much of the backlog have we worked through? And truthfully, I think we've done a good job doing that. But then I ran this for the January cattle on feed report from LMIC, or I said that wrong. It's USDA's cattle on feed report, but this is data from the LMIC. And this is the number of cattle on feed over 120 days. And I think, to me, the fact that this is higher again in 2019, in fact, it's about 10% higher, tells me that, some of this backlog is still kind of working its way through. So if this is January 1, cattle on feed over 120 days, these are going to have to move sometime in the next 1 to 3 months. So sometime in the first quarter of 2021. So we're still feeling some of the effects of that backlog, I think, even today. And then this is the other interesting piece of it. Red line's kind of a longer run average. That's 2014 to 2018. Dotted line's 2019. Blue line's 2020. I want you to notice just that in a typical year, we see harvest weights or dressed weights, slaughter weights, decrease from the first of the year down to about the first or second week of June. All right. I want you to notice in 2020, though, there for about 6 weeks, we were increasing harvest weights at a time when we usually see those harvest weights go down. And yes, we've regressed back more somewhat to what you might call a more normal dressed weight level, but we're still considerably above last year and the long run average. And again, I would remind you that we're doing this in the face of a much, much higher corn price. So this is not insignificant. I do look for weights to come down a fair amount during 2021, but the fact that we're still running that much above year ago levels, to me, speaks to the fact that there was some cattle in the system still. Now, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about prices here in Kentucky. Kentucky and Ohio markets track, I think, reasonably well. I tried to pull up some data from Ohio. It was hard to find a lot of it, to be honest with you. But it looks to me like you all track reasonably well with us. So I'm going to use Kentucky prices and talk about things. Understand, I'm going to throw out some point numbers, and just, you kind of got to adjust those somewhat. If you know kind of how your markets compare to ours, then you can kind of adjust those accordingly. I'll also try and talk more about change year over year. Sometimes that's a little easier to kind of process if you're not in the exact same market as I am. But if you look at what heavy feeder cattle did, so any of you that may take cattle up to heavier weights or may have maybe a sideline background or a stocker type operation, if you're moving heavy feeders, they dropped about $25 a hundredweight from January of 2020 to about April of the same year. Okay. but we gained back about 75% of that from spring until the end of summer. So August is our typical high price point for those heavy feeder cattle. They typically move down from there. So really the second half of the year, or the last 5 months was not all that unusual. It was just simply shifted down. And it was this market impact that hit so many of us so hard. On a state average basis for January, those same steers were kind of in that 123 to 125 range for 850-pound steer. Now, this is obviously focused more on cow-calf. I'll spend most of my time here. The biggest thing that COVID did in 2020 is it took away our spring run-up in calf prices. So focus on that blue line there, that's 2020 prices. In a normal year, we would see those calf prices run up about 15 cents or so from the first of the year to spring, as our stocker operators are placing some of those wean calves into stocker programs, grazing programs. We didn't see that this year. In fact, what we saw a decrease in price from February to about April and May, which is very unusual. I'm convinced this calf market last spring would have been at least 20 cents higher per pound, so about $100, $120 per head higher had we not had COVID. So the big impact on the calf market was what it did in the spring to a lot of those fall calving operations that were selling wean calves in April and May of 2020. Now, if you look at our fall calf market, when most of our calves run through, it actually averaged just a tick higher than 2019, which I think surprised a lot of folks. Now, without COVID, without the backlog, we still see better prices, but there's no doubt in my mind that that spring market was hit much harder than that fall market. In terms of just kind of walking through the wrath of the market in 2020, talk about it this way. I'm not going to talk about cattle finishing, of course, in this particular program. I'll share some thoughts on retained ownership a little bit later. But if you had some folks that retained ownership, had cattle coming off feed this spring, they were hit the hardest, period. There's no question about it. The closer cattle were to harvest to the knife, the harder the market hit them. And that stands to reason, of course. Folks who had wintered cattle through the 2019-2020 winter and were going to be selling heavy feeders, some of those 8 weeks in the spring of the year, they were hit the hardest. And of course, when the first round of CFAP came out, there was kind of that hard deadline between the higher CARES payment and the lower inventory payment. And anything held past April 15th fell in that lower inventory payment. So outside of that, these folks were definitely hit the next hardest after our cattle that were on full feed. Those fall calving herds, that were selling wean calves in the spring of the year, they sold calves for, $125 less than they would have, I think, otherwise. Most likely they had calves past that April. They had not sold calves before the April 15 CFAP 1 deadline. And then with our spring calving herds, although prices weren't off of 2019, there were still lingering effects. And I have no doubt in my mind that even our fall calf market last year was 5 to 10 cents lower than it would have been had it not been for COVID impacts. The one bright spot was Cull cow and Cull bull prices, and I'll use Kentucky as my illustration here. We averaged last year for an 80 to 85% boning cow somewhere in the upper 150s. Spent some time in the summer in the low 60s. And I always use my average dress as my baseline, but you can add another dime for your high dress cows. And a lot of these cows were in pretty good shape when they moved last year. They may have been fed for a while, I don't know. Maybe there were some open cows, I'm not sure. But a pretty large share of those actually sold in that high dress category. So a lot of these Cull cows actually moved well in the 60s and even in the 70s. In a few cases, I saw some Cull cows moving in the low 80s last year. So we had a really good Cull cow market. Bulls were very similar. Couple things here. I think number one, we had very much had an at-home meat consumption market, and that tends to lend itself more to ground beef than it does some of your more valuable muscle cuts. Right? You think about your upper end steaks more as a food service restaurant type market, at-home consumption, a little bit more ground beef oriented. That was one piece of it. The other thing, though, and I'll mention cow slaughter in a little bit later, but we never saw the cow slaughter levels drop as much as we did the steer and heifer slaughter levels. And I think there's a couple of reasons for this probably, but one reason I think is very significant is that our cow culling plants tend to be less regionally concentrated. They tend to be more spread out across the U.S. And as the pandemic and the labor impacts hit different parts of the country at different times, the impacts were more spread out in the cow sector. So, like I said, the overall beef production was down 35% at one time in early May. I think the worst it got for cull cows was like 12%. So we stayed a whole lot more current. And you combine that with fairly strong ground beef demand that I think we saw in terms of the cull cow market. Now, as I start working my way towards some 2021 forecast, here's some things in the back of my mind. So, we're still dealing with a lot of uncertainty and adjustment. And I don't think any of us would argue with that. It would seem like it was just one thing after another in 2020. There was the spread of the pandemic. There was the effect on the economy. There were political questions. Then there was, questions about a vaccine, and then vaccine availability, and now there's vaccine distribution. All these things are just unknowns, and markets don't like unknowns. I think, as I go forward, the idea in the back of my mind is things look a whole lot different, in 6 months than they do now, and way different in another 6 months. That's kind of the forecast. That's kind of what my forecast is based on, is a return towards normalcy, certainly in the second half of 2021. But I can be wrong about that, obviously. But that's just what I'm going to use kind of going forward as kind of a forecasting approach. I really do think, had we not been dealing with the pandemic, we'd be talking a whole lot more about how much impact these rising feed prices have had and will have in 2021. I would be hard pressed to think of a year since 2012 when I saw a bigger swing in grain prices within season. I'd have to think about it, but it's been a long time since we saw this much run up in feed prices from spring of the year to fall of the year. And then weather's been a challenge too. I'll show you a drought monitor here in just a minute, but about the western half of the U.S. is dealing with some pretty significant weather challenges, and that has an impact in terms of cow numbers and management going forward. So this is U.S. beef cow numbers, and I'm showing you annual numbers. We'll get a new estimate from them on this Friday. So I guess I'm 3 days ahead of being able to share that with you. But it certainly looks like 2019 was our high water mark in terms of beef cow numbers. We brought beef cow numbers down coming into 2021. I think they'll be down 1.5% going into 2021. I'm sorry, I misspoke there. So we had smaller cow herd in 2020. I think we'll see an even smaller cow herd in 2021. I look for another 1 to 1.5% decrease. Excuse me for saying that wrong. So the good news going forward is we should see another smaller calf crop in 2021. And again, that's a key first step in building stronger calf prices going forward. This is that drought monitor. And you can draw a line basically from Minnesota down to about the central part of Texas, and you can notice that the western half of the U.S. is dealing with severe drought and has been for a while. Remember where the bulk of our cows are. The bulk of our cows are in three main areas, what I think of as kind of the southern plains, so kind of think Texas, Oklahoma, this area. The northern plains, also dry, and then the southeast is kind of that third area. So we've got dry conditions in two of those three major areas, and those two that are dry, by the way, have got more cows than those of us here in the southeast. So this is something to think about going forward. And then the other indicator that I like to look at for an expectation of beef cow numbers going forward is I like to look at cow slaughter. A lot of attention gets paid to heifer retention, and rightfully so. But the other piece of this is how hard are we culling the mature cows? So red line here is 2020, black line is 2019. You can see kind of again our low water mark here in the cow market. A little bit earlier, by the way, was April for our cow slaughter market. What I think is most interesting, and when I put this together, I did not have December slaughter numbers, so I'd only talk about the first 11 months of 2020 versus the first 11 months of 2019. But despite the fact that we had a smaller cow herd in 2020, despite the fact that we culled the cow herd pretty hard in 2019, and despite the fact that we dealt with a pandemic that impacted slaughter volumes in the spring of the year, we still actually slaughtered 2.5% more cows through the first 11 months of 2020 than we did in 2019. All this together, I don't see how we don't come into 2021 with the smaller cow herd out there, which again is a good thing. Combining that smaller cow herd and smaller calf crop with another positive on the demand side, I'm pretty optimistic about the export markets. I was very optimistic last year, and part of that was kind of pork related due to African swine fever. But obviously, when you look at the spring and summer of 2020, yeah, we had some serious decrease in exports, but a lot of that was availability, right? It was not so much export demand; it was more about availability due to U.S. production. The last couple of months have been very encouraging, and I think that will continue, and I think we'll have strong export demand. So when I think about this decrease in production, I think we're likely to see a decrease in the calf crop, and then at least a flat production on the beef side. And I think about probably more robust and a pretty significant increase in exports. I'm a lot more optimistic about 2021 than I certainly was 2019 and even 2020, knowing what we do now. Very easy to say. But I'll look for these calf prices to increase probably about 20 cents from now to spring. So I'm saying a 550-pound steer calf will probably move somewhere in the 160s on a state average basis in Kentucky. I think we'll see groups in the 170s. I think you could see really good groups of 5-weight steers probably in the low 180s by, say, April or so. There's always something psychological about $2 calves, and I can't tell you how many times folks have asked me about, when are we going to see $2 calves again? And the truth is, I think we'll see some $2 calves in the spring of 2021, but I think they're going to be probably calves that weigh close to 400 pounds. We'll just make a really quick point about that. Don't get totally wrapped up chasing prices. For example, I would not be at all surprised if we had some light fours, some calves kind of in that $4 to $4.25 range that do sell for near $2 a pound come spring. As we think about these stock operators placing some of these calves on grass, I think we'll see that. If I've got a group of 525-pound calves that sell for $2 a pound, they sell for $850 a head. Okay. If instead I have a 550-pound steer, weighs 125 pounds more, he sells for $1.75, 25 cents back of that $4.25 calf. He sells for $963 a head. So again, there's something about $2 calves, I get it, but I always want to know right after that, okay, what did they weigh? And the number we multiply times price is weight. And oftentimes that's the most important number that we've got to think about as cow-calf operators. That's the one that's in our control. I do think we'll see a stronger fall calf market too than we saw in 2020. If I had to give you a guess, I think we'll see those 5-weight steers in the upper 140s, groups in the 150s. This one's a little bit harder to predict because I don't know what those feed prices are going to do. Feed prices have very little impact on our calf market in the spring. They have much more impact in the fall of the year. So I'm making this forecast assuming that feed prices stay relatively high during 2021. If we have a big corn crop in 2021, and if feed prices are cheaper, come fall of the year, then I think we could actually see, another nickel or so on these calves pretty easily. So I'm basically going to call these calves about a dime higher per pound. So think $50 a head roughly on a 5-weight steer than we saw in 2020. So a better calf market, not a great calf market, but a better calf market. If you move heavier feeders, my best guess would be that those 850-pound steers are somewhere kind of in the mid-130s by spring and probably the low 140s by fall is kind of where I would put them. Share a few thoughts now on some different sectors, and then I'll move into some management considerations. I think on the cow-calf side that 2021 should be the 2020 we expected. Calf crop is smaller. Export market to me looks very encouraging. Domestic market should be improving throughout 2021. So I look for pretty decent or much improved 2021. I think fall calvers, selling calves this spring will be pretty happy. I think it's been 5 or 6 years since we have seen the kind of calf prices that we're going to see in spring of 2021. I sure hope I'm right about that. I do think unless there's a major change in feed price, meaning a very large corn crop, a very good yielding corn crop, I think we'll see a pretty significant drop between spring calf price and fall calf price. I'm thinking it'll be about 20 cents a pound difference in what a 5-weight steer sells for in April versus what that same steer sells for in November of 2021. Even with a better market, though, we are going to see limited returns to land and capital. That's just a fact. These cow-calf operators are going to cover their cash costs. They're going to cover feed costs. They're going to cover vet medicine. They're going to cover those kind of costs. They're going to see limited returns to land, labor, and capital, and that's pretty normal in the cow-calf sector. So yes, we will make money on paper, but we're not going to see a huge return to the time and the risk that we're taking. As I think about a summer stocker market, and I'm going to focus this on the cow-calf side as much as I can, I really do think this calf market will run this spring. If you're somebody who likes to keep your calves post-weaning in the spring, and I'm a proponent of that, by the way, just be aware that you're probably going to see some pretty valuable calves this spring, and we're going to be very vulnerable to market swings simply because we're going to have a little bit tighter corn supply, at least through the growing season of 2021. One thing I will say, though, is what really drives oftentimes those stocker margins is what calves are worth in the spring of the year. And high feed prices basically limit the ability of our feed-based operations to bid on calves in the spring. So stocker operators oftentimes can get calves bought cheaper because they're not competing as aggressively with some of those feed-based operations. So if feed prices stay high, that typically increases the return to a stocker type enterprise, which means if you've got calves you're going to wean this spring and you like to keep those post-weaning, probably a good year to think about doing it, simply because the cost what you can put on those calves via grass is going to be cheaper than what it's going to cost to do it via feed. So do keep that in the back of your mind. I don't know how common this is. I probably should have asked Garth or Stan, but I never know how many folks actually retain ownership on cattle through finishing Kentucky until something major happens like we saw in 2020, but then I start getting those calls. And, every time I got one of those calls this spring or summer, it was a tough conversation because every group of cattle that was on feed and came off feed sometime, between April and about June, about a 5-figure loss. So those are not pleasant conversations. So I'm not a huge fan of this, mostly because I just see more red ink than black ink. But, if you want to finish cattle, if you want to finish your cattle out west on a custom feed yard basis, what I typically tell folks is, got to know the quality of them, right? You don't want to learn the quality of your cattle via a kill sheet. That's oftentimes a very expensive lesson to learn. There's just always a lot of difference across cow herds. So know the cattle before you retain ownership on them. Consider shared ownership arrangements. I don't like 100% retained ownership. I like some sort of arrangement where both the feed yard and the cattle owner have skin in the game. So I would look at something like that. Don't ship cattle in the red. I mean, I see people all the time that'll tell me, yeah, I'm going to ship these cattle. The market doesn't look good right now, but if fed cattle prices increase by, 5 or 10 cents a pound, I'll make money on them. Okay, then sell the cattle and buy a live cattle futures contract. You don't need to ship the cattle out west if you're going to be speculating on the live cattle market. And frankly, if you're shipping cattle into the red, meaning if they're going to lose money when you ship them out there, you're basically just speculating that fed cattle market goes up. So I don't encourage that. If the goal is data, meaning if your goal with retained ownership is to learn about the quality of your cattle, and that's very admirable, by the way, I think you should think about doing that. Price aggressively. Don't worry about riding the market swings. Just be aggressive on your pricing, limit your risk, and focus on the value of the data. Don't focus so much on the market. And then I'll leave you with this and shift to some more management stuff. But this is, I think, pretty much region-wide. But I've just been stunned at how much demand there has been for cattle being purchased off the farm for freezer beef. We do this on a small scale ourselves, so I've kind of got a foot in this world, if you will. We were already pretty low on processing capacity at the local level in Kentucky, and right now you probably can't even get a harvest date in the towards the end of 2021. You're probably looking 2022. So huge increase in demand for this, huge increase in consumer demand. The other thing to be aware of, I see a lot of these Craigslist ads and Facebook, posts and things. A lot of these finished cattle being sold as freezer beef are not finished cattle. They're just big feeder cattle. So it's a really strange market right now. So if this is a piece of your marketing plan, and I like it, by the way, you got to think really far ahead and do a good job planning and get those dates booked and work closely with consumers. They've got people probably reaching out to them like they never have before. So now we're going to shift gears and talk about some more management related things. And I'm just going to kind of leave you, with some thoughts that you might can implement to improve profitability, not just in 2021, but going forward. So three major kind of categories here. Talk about post-weaning programs first and just keeping calves post-weaning. Think about like preconditioning enterprises, short-term backgrounding, call it what you want. But do I want to sell do I want to sell calves off the cow, or can I make some more money by keeping these calves a bit longer post-weaning? Talk about some fairly simple things that I think it's easy to forget sometimes, and we'll talk about some things like that. So just basically don't stop doing, good producers don't stop doing the little things. And then strive for uniformity. And that can mean a lot of things. It can mean certainly how our cattle look, color, breed, genetics, what have you. I'm going to talk about it in terms of age and calving season, because I think that's a piece that can be pretty easily, I won't say easily, but it can definitely be dealt with, that I think has a big impact on our bottom lines as well. So this is the Kentucky market summary I brought this up yesterday. So this is our market summary from last week. I'll make a quick point though about just the value of preconditioning. So this was the report itself. This is a complete copy and paste from Monday's report from our AMS market reporters. Feeder cattle were in mostly moderate to good demand, with buyers showing the best demand for long-weaned 45-plus day preconditioned cattle. A statement like that is almost always on these market reports. This is the market reporter's way of saying that, frankly, the cattle that were not green, that were not right off the cow, outsold the calves that were, period. A few quick examples. So our market reporters typically use the word value added when they are describing cattle that have they're at least not fresh off the cow. They've been weaned and at least have one sort of shot. So I've got kind of my light 5-weight category here. Okay, so here's my nondescript cattle, my non-value added cattle. They averaged about 143. Value added cattle about 152. So about a 9 cent a pound or 9 hundredweight difference. Here's the same thing for my heavy 5. This is almost suspiciously high, but here's my nondescript cattle, around 137, value added cattle 154. Here's my light 6s, value added 136, non-value added 132. I always tell the whole story. Here's the same thing for my heavy 6s, by the way, and I see just about $1 difference per hundredweight. Now, one reason I want to point this out is because I don't want to doctor the numbers at all. Part of the reason why you see these premiums get smaller as calves get heavier, obviously, is because the lighter the cattle are, the more vulnerable they are, right? So that's a piece of it. And if you look at most of these, there's a pretty significant advantage to selling cattle that are not fresh off the cow in terms of price. Now, I want to talk a minute now about the other piece of that. And a lot of folks will look at those premiums and say, well, Kenny, if they're only paying, another 10 cents a pound premium, and I'm weaning 500-pound steers, for example, that's $50 a head. I don't think I can do it for $50 a head. And they're ignoring another key component, and that's the weight that those cattle gain during that preconditioning time period. So when I talk to producers about preconditioning or, we are keeping cattle post-weaning, I like to kind of walk them through a series of things here. So it starts with calf price at weaning time. This is ultimately the cost, your first cost of a preconditioning program. What you don't sell that calf for at weaning time. That's cost number one. Then you've got to estimate what they're going to sell for in 45, 60, 90 days. And I'm going to show you a 60-day program here in just a second. There's ways to do that. Current market provides some direction. Futures provide some direction. Then you've also got to think, okay, if I'm going to be going from moving green calves to moving value-added wean type calves, am I going to also get some price premium too? The answer is oftentimes yes. And the way I like to describe it is what you usually see is you don't see near as much price slide from selling your 550-pound calf to selling a 700-pound steer when you actually have some premium thrown in there. So then I got to figure feed cost, and I've got to think about other costs to do it. I'm going to mention a few things about forwards that are kind of important out here, I think, as we kind of go forward. So simple scenario, and I'm doing this in January, so kind of bear with me. It's a really weird time to be talking about preconditioning, but I don't want to ignore it either. But if a 508 steer is worth about $1.50, and that's not a bad estimate right now of our weaning calves right now, which no one probably is right now, but if I were it's worth $1.50, there's kind of a starting place. If I were to think about just a simple ration, 2.5% of body weight, half of that from some sort of 50-50 corn, gluten, soy hull mix at $2.20 a ton, which is pretty expensive right now, obviously. And then the other half grass hay at $75 a ton, and assume that puts on about 2.25 pounds a day. I figure mineral, quarter pound a day at $20 a bag. Then I just try and estimate a sale price for a 685 that's value added in about 60 days. Return looks something like this. And I don't want you to focus on the numbers, just the concept so much, but this is what you want to do when you do this at weaning time. Think about what's my calf worth right now? What will it cost me to get them, to, whatever my target is. I'm using 60 days here, but, 90, 120 is also fine. Build in interest, build in an expectation of death loss, build in other cost, and see what that looks like. Now, a few things I want to point out here that I think are important. For one thing, I've got selling expenses very low. And the reason I do is because if I'm going to be selling these calves at weaning time, I'm going to pay commission at weaning time. So when I start thinking about the preconditioning program, the real additional selling cost is how much more commission do I pay selling, in this case, a 685 than I do a 550. And in truth, it's not very much. Similar on transportation. For a lot of us, it won't cost us any more to haul a 685 pound steer than a 550 pound steer. So a lot of those costs are already kind of sunk in a cow-calf enterprise, not to mention if these are own calves that I've produced, I'm probably going to have lower vet medicine expenses, and I'm probably going to have lower death loss. So certainly want to keep that in mind. All right, going forward. So when you think about doing this, now here's the take-home stuff. So I wanted to show you kind of a quick estimate that's somewhat realistic based on now. But here's a quick estimate though. Look at this at weaning time, all right? Know it's constantly changing. And that's the most important thing is, you want to do this literally at weaning time to make a decision of what makes the most sense for you. Look at feed cost and look at value of gain. Understand, most importantly, that this is a viable sector of the beef system. There are people that do nothing but buy weaned calves and put weight on them through grazing enterprises and through backgrounding feed-based type enterprises. Okay, that's what they do. So understand that is a valuable part of the business. And it's always going to look better on owned calves than purchased calves because they're lower risk calves. And like I said, some of those costs you're going to have with the cow-calf sector anyway. So if I showed you that same budget on purchased calves and I've got higher death loss, more vet medicine expense, I've got full commission and full transportation, I can't make money in 60 days. Okay, it looks better if these are owned calves from a cow-calf operation than if I'm buying them myself. Also understand how grass impacts this. I'm a big believer in grazing. Your cheapest pounds you can add are typically via grazing. In the spring, if you're a fall calving operation that weans calves in the spring, most of us can't keep up with our grass in the spring. You're going to clip it, in late May, early June anyway, right? In fact, if you can keep up with grass in the spring of the year, you're probably overstocked in the summer. So most of us simply have an excess of grass in the spring of the year. So if I'm a fall calving operation, I'm going to find a way to utilize that, whether that be keeping calves on the cow longer, maybe pulling those calves off and grazing them for a period of time before I sell them. There's some value right there of gain that I can snag pretty easily. A lot of folks like to think about fall grass as being free. In reality, that's the one I think is the most expensive because if I'm a spring calving cow-calf operation, weaning calves in the fall, and I've got excess grass in the fall to take some of those calves post-weaning, understand the cost of that grass is actually the additional feeding days that I've got on those cows. So the rule of thumb that I like to use for valuing that fall grass is kind of a simple roughing economist rule here, but I get about 2 grazing days for a calf for 1 grazing day for a cow. So if it costs me, simple math, $1.50 to feed $1.50 a day to feed my cows through the winter, then every 2 days that I graze a calf, I lose one of those. So about 75 cents a day in that case is kind of a rule of thumb for what those grazing days are worth on those calves in the fall. So be aware, grass really isn't free. And in the case in fall, it's a matter of if I use that grass for my calves, that's grass I don't have for my cows, which means I feed more hay in the winter because of it. So that's the cost of using fall stockpile or fall grass. Don't stop doing the little things. Here's a simple one. Steers versus bulls. It was funny when the market was really high in 2014 and 15. Had a lot of folks tell me, Kenny, they're paying that much for a bull calf. I'm not going to bother castrating and selling steers. And then I hear the same thing when the calf market's low. Gosh, they're not paying for this. I'm not going to do it anymore. One of the more common questions that I get from folks will be something related to steers versus bulls. And they'll call me and they'll be about half mad. They'll say, Kenny, tell me why bulls are outselling steers at blank market. And what's inevitably happened is they've probably sold a group of steers. And sometime, while they're at the yards, they saw a similar group come through, similar weight of bulls that sold for the same price or better. And that's going to happen from time to time. It absolutely is. I went back, though, when I pulled every monthly price, steers and bulls, state average, 550-pound weight category from January of 2010 to December of 2020. So I've got 11 years worth of data here. There was not a single month, mind you, okay, when bulls actually outsold steers the same weight. On average, during that time period, the difference was $11.14 a hundredweight, which means if I've got a bull calf and a steer calf that weighed the exact same, they both weighed 550 pounds, they ran through the yard side by side, the steer outsells the bull by $61.27. Okay, so for false precision, it's a silly round number. Think 60, 65 bucks. Okay. Now, a legitimate question that you may have is, well, won't bulls outweigh steers? And the answer is, yeah, they probably will. Okay. So I like to kind of quantify it this way. How many more pounds does that bull have to weigh to offset that price discount? Now, understand additional pounds are not worth the sale price. If the average price for 550-pound steer is $1.50, another 100 pounds isn't worth $1.50 each, right? Because of price slide. As I add more pounds, that price comes down. So 80 cents to $1 is a pretty good rule of thumb where value gain is in most markets when I account for price slide. So in a fairly high value gain market, that bull's got to outweigh that steer by 62 pounds, meaning if that bull weighs 550, if that steer weighs 550, that bull's got to weigh 612 to offset that difference. In an 80-cent market, which is probably frankly more closer to normal, he's got to outweigh that steer by 77 pounds, which is a tall task. And unless you're in a market where you cannot use, if you're in a natural market where you're being paid for natural and cannot use implants, they provide an option as well, because you can get the bull gain and still have the steer price. So look at your options. The market absolutely rewards us for steers versus bulls most of the time. If there's one number on a cow-calf operation that tells me more than anything else it's winning rate, it's calculated right. I think it is the most important measure for a cow-calf operator to track. Good operations should be in the 90%. So all I'm simply saying is what percent of my cows wean me a calf every year. So 90 to 95% is where good operations should strive to be. I promise you though, folks, there are people out there, maybe not in Ohio, but in Kentucky, there are some out there that are probably weaning calf crops somewhere in the, low to mid 70s. And I can tell you the advice I would give someone who weans 93% calf crops is way different than someone who weans 73% calf crops. Okay, so that's a number you need to know for sure year in, year out. Another way to say it would be, it's how I convert revenue per calf to revenue per cow. If I look at what my average calf sells for and don't account for the fact that I had a certain percentage of my cows that did not wean me a calf, I'm way overinflating my revenue on a per cow basis. So I've got to make that conversion one way or another. Simple illustration here. If I assume a weaning weight of 550 pounds and I look at roughly $1.40 steer heifer average price, That's $770 per calf sold, okay? At a 90% weaning rate, which is very strong, by the way, okay? That means that I'm going to wean 9 calves out of every 10 cows that I expose to a bull. That revenue per calf of 770 is really a revenue per cow of 693 bucks. The same thing at 75%, that 770 per calf is 578 per cow. Again, big difference in what I can stand in terms of market price and profitability if I can think about this number and manage it very well. So the obvious question that comes in as a follow-up is, what about open cows? I don't advocate keeping them. Very few people do. I have heard cases where someone has tried to make an argument that it makes sense to keep cows, that maybe they didn't breed back the second calf. Okay, fine. I could live with some of those sort of things. As a general rule, I don't like to keep open cows, period. I think, especially when prices are where they are now, I think you could lose potential in 1 year. I have producers that tell me that they have 2 calving seasons. They have a spring and a fall calving season. And what they'll do is they'll roll a cow from one season to the other. In other words, if she didn't get bred to calve in the spring, I'll breed her to calve in the fall. Okay, I can buy that. I'm losing half a year now, not a full year. But this is really a timing question, folks. It really is. And as we think about this in terms of calving or timing, I've got to preg check soon enough and know she's open soon enough to get her bred back and in cycle with the next season. So, that makes sure that if you're using an argument that you really are in fact able to do just that, because I think a lot of folks probably don't preg check early enough to actually shift from one season to another. If you don't have a defined calving season, I would encourage you to start by simply managing calving interval. Write down the dates of when your cows calve. Track that. For example, someone may say, well, yeah, she calved every year. Maybe she calved in January of 2017, April of 2018, August 2019, and you see where I'm going, right? Start managing calving interval. If you've got cows that are weaning or having a calf every 15 months, okay, she'll be open for every 5 years, right? So just understand that's the same thing as an 80% calving rate. So learn to manage calving interval. And folks, you got to make that a culling criteria. You got to start unloading cows that aren't weaning a calf every 12 months. And if you start doing that, I think your calving season will tighten up as you do that. Late calving cows cost us a lot. And I want to make one quick point here that I think oftentimes gets overlooked. We oftentimes talk about late calving cows in the way that we think about, okay, every cycle that I miss is 21 days. Those calves are younger at weaning time, so I give up 40 pounds weaning, and that's absolutely true. I probably am giving up 30 or 40 pounds of revenue for every cycle that I miss getting the cow bred, because those younger, later born calves are smaller, period. That makes sense. The other piece of this, though, that I think gets lost sometimes is this one right here. This is probably the most important chart that I'm going to show you tonight. Some work that Greg Hallich and I did back in 2015. We did an analysis of preconditioned feeder cattle sales from Lexington from 2005 to 2012. We held everything constant statistically, including fed cattle market, corn price, type of cattle, when they were sold, weight. And all I'm showing you here is just 2 things, okay? The y-axis is the price improvement or price premium, a price difference, and the x-axis is how many calves sold in one group. And each one of these circles is 5. Okay, so here's a group of 5, group of 10, 15, 20, and so on. Now, somewhere up in here is a truckload lot. And we all know that if we could all sell truckload lots, we would. That's the most efficient way to sell cattle. Price tends to be highest. When I talk to a cow-calf audience like I am tonight, though, I want to focus you on the other end of the chart. I want to focus you right down here because this is where the action is, okay? So, for example, this is a single. This is a group of 5, okay? Will a group of 5 outsell a single? The answer is yes. In this study, by about $11 a hundredweight. This isn't a pot load, folks. This is a group of 5, okay? Will a group of 10 outsell a 5? Yeah, by about $4 a hundredweight. Okay, so most of us are not big enough to be up here on this end of the chart. The story is I've got to stay out of this end of the chart. Now, How does this relate to calving season? Well, it's very simple. Those cows that are straggler cows, in addition to the fact that those calves are lighter at weaning time, there's also going to be fewer of them, which means they're going to be selling more along the left side of this chart in smaller groups. And when I account for both the loss in weaning weight and the fact that more of those smaller calves get sold as singles, twos, and threes, I think the cost can exceed $150 per calf sold for some of those cows that don't get bred on the first 2 or 3 cycles. So I'm a big believer in calving season. And frankly, although it's hard to do sometimes, culling is your best tool to get there. You've got to make this a culling criteria because it's hard to back cows up. If she didn't breed till 3rd or 4th cycle in 2020, she ain't going to breed 1st cycle in 2021, right? So I got to make some tough decisions, and I've got to make some culling based on that. Make that a criteria and part of the cow's job. Last thing I want to talk about briefly is just share some thoughts with you on cow size and how this should impact my expectations of weaning weight from my cows. So it's pretty well established in the animal science literature, and I'm an economist, not an animal scientist, but it's pretty well established that weaning weight increases with cow size. Listened to a really good presentation by a woman in Lexington at an All-Tech conference several years ago that did a meta-analysis. She did an outstanding job. She did a meta-analysis that looked at different studies and basically tracked mature cow size and weaning weight. And what she found was, yeah, bigger cows do wean bigger calves, but not proportionally so. And I think that was the key point that kind of got my mind thinking about this. I think we all kind of know it. We just don't oftentimes do a lot with it. There's no question, though, that maintenance cost per cow increase as cow size increases. So I combine this with this notion that a lot of producers don't know cost of production, and understandably so. I think that should be a goal for all of us, but it's difficult for a cow-calf operation. But even if you do know cost of production, what you probably know is cost of production on average. So you may know what it costs you to maintain your average cow, but you don't know what it costs you to maintain this cow versus that cow versus another cow. And that really is what matters in terms of making culling decisions. Now, here's the reason that I'm saying this. There's a danger if I just simply use weaning weight as a criteria for cow culling. If I simply start ranking my cows based on weaning weight and just start culling the cows that are weaning those smaller calves, on average, I'm going to be culling my smaller cows, okay? As I do that, my average cow size goes up and my costs go up. So the danger there is if I'm making culling decisions based on weaning weight and I'm ignoring the fact that some of those cows may be different sizes and may actually have different costs. So there's no easy way to do this, but I want to show you one simple approach and share some things with you that I think might make some sense. So if I provide you with a list of basic costs for a cow-calf operation, winter feed, pasture, vet medicine, breeding, mineral, trucking, marketing, transportation, breeding stock, all these things are important, okay? The vast majority of them are going to go up with cow size. Certainly winter feed is. She's going to consume more hay in the winter. We may not see it, but pasture costs go up. She consumes more pasture too. Vet medicine costs are kind of a grayer area, but if we think about dosages and treatments, yeah, that may go up as well. Breeding costs probably won't. She will consume more mineral. And at the margin, it may cost me more to truck a larger cow, for example. So a lot of these things matter. So we did just a quick spreadsheet analysis and kind of been sharing it with some folks, but we made these assumptions. We took our basic cow-calf budget and just tried to run it at different cow sizes, okay? So in other words, I took my basic budget and assumed that was like a 1,250-pound cow. Then I ran the same thing for cows of all different sizes. And the assumptions that we made were pretty simple. We assumed that feed, pasture, and mineral cost went up fully proportional, meaning that a 10% larger cow consumed 10% more feed, pasture, and mineral. We assumed that vet medicine, transportation, and other costs were half proportional, meaning a 10% larger cow had a 5% higher cost for vet medicine, transportation, and other costs. We assumed breeding costs weren't affected. So that's kind of the approach that we took. What our basic findings were, and this is kind of the simple take home, what we basically found was for every additional 100 pounds of mature cow size that I was maintaining, I needed about 50 more pounds of weaned calf to justify those additional costs. In other words, if you've got a 1,200 pound cow and a 1,400 pound cow side by side, the 1,400 pound cow is costing you enough more than the 1,200 pound cow that she should be weaning you a 100 pound larger calf. If not, the 1,200 pound cow is more profitable for you. Now, this is a good concept. It's hard in practice to know mature cow weights, although some folks may want to weigh their cows. But one idea that I've had is, could you use your Cull cow weights as a way to calibrate cows into groups? And then just kind of in the back of your mind know, okay, this is a larger frame cow. I should have this expectation for her in terms of weaning weight. It's a moderate frame cow. Here's what I should be expecting. And then small frame cow. Most important thing is understand conceptually that we can't just make our decisions based strictly on a weaning weight. I've also got to think about, how does that weaning weight compare to mature cow size? And 50% of body weight gets us there at the margin. It's a pretty good rule of thumb that's been around for a long time. A lot of folks did kind of push back on this and understand why they did. They raised the question about, well, what about frame size? And rightfully so, they would say, we really want to make sure that we're not getting small frame calves, because we're all well aware there's big discounts for calves that go into that small frame category. Medium and large frame calves tend to be the bulk of what's reported, and that's kind of the baseline. And again, 2 studies here in Kentucky, we've seen $10 and $20 per hundredweight discounts on small frame calves. I do want to make this point, though, before I leave this topic, that for an animal to be small, to be graded small frame as a feeder animal, the grader has to think that when finished to half an inch of back fat, that steer is going to weigh less than 1,100 pounds and heifer less than 1,000. And I say that because our average slaughter weight right now is over 1,400 pounds. So I just want you to understand that in most cases, we're a long way away from seeing a lot of our calves hit that small frame category. So if this is an issue for you that you'd like to target, a lot of you may well have more room than you think to bring down cow size some and still be well in that medium to large frame category. I'm going to wrap things up here with a few final thoughts. Whenever I talk to cow-calf groups, I like to just share a few general comments. So often economists do a talk like the one I've done tonight, and the feedback is, it wasn't really that encouraging. And I do understand that. So that's part of it's just simple the way economists are trained, right? We're taught to analyze, we're taught to, to look at things a certain way. And frankly, we're taught to kind of get in there and dig. That's just what we do. So I do understand that. I always tell folks, stick with what works and focus on what you can control. And you can control a lot of things. Some of the things you can't control are the market. And so oftentimes what I hear from folks is discussion of the market. But frankly, we're in an environment where it's difficult for us to do a whole lot to impact the sale value of our cattle. We've talked about preconditioning. We've talked about steers versus bulls. We've talked about lots, as we've talked about some things that we can do to impact the market. But in a lot of ways, more of that stuff is outside of our control than in our control. Look for ways to add value, be efficient, and always think long run. One of the things that I think has always been an Achilles heel in the cow-calf sector is we manage cow-calf operations as though they're kind of a single year operation, and they're not. Every cow that you own, is a 6, 8, 10, 12-year investment. And you've got to think that way about it. Why did bred heifer prices get so darn high in 2014? Well, it's because the calf market got so high in 2014. Did any of us really think it was going to stay that way for 8, 10, 12 years? No. But it would almost have to have done so to justify the $3,000 bred heifer prices a lot of us were seeing out there. Okay, so always think long term. Don't get wrapped up in current calf price. Think about, what's a realistic long run average calf price. Most of your decisions should be made with that number in the back of your mind, not current price. In reality, and this is just a bitter pill to swallow, but it's true, the average cow-calf producer sees pretty limited return to land and management in the long run. Now, I don't mean that he or she sees none, don't hear me saying that, but understand that we're in an environment where we're price takers. There's no barriers of entry. And as soon as we start making really good money, what's going to happen? We're going to grow the cow herd. We did it in 2014 and 15. We'll do it again here in a few years. Okay. Just understand that's the environment that we're in. We do spoil our own markets. And then we act surprised sometimes that's what happens. So a lot of folks look at that and they say, well, if the average cow-calf producer sees limited returns to land and management in the long run, why do I want to do this? I look at it the other way and I say, well, if the average cow-calf producer sees limited return to management in the long run, the message to me is don't be average. Profitable producers are the ones that do well in a normal market. They do really well in a strong market, and they can survive a few years of a tough market. If that's a recipe for being profitable long run. So I've tried to give you a few ideas. There's lots of things you can do, but you always want to be looking for ways to become more efficient, to wean better calves, and to have a greater return to what you do. I do believe money can be made in the cow-calf sector, but I absolutely believe the trick is you've got to be better than average year in and year out. Started back last fall, started doing a cattle market notes weekly. I partnered with a couple of colleagues of mine, Josh Maples at Mississippi State, James Mitchell at University of Arkansas. So we alternate this, but once a week, one of us writes a market update. There's price data and price tables for various states. Although we're in the Southeast and it is a little bit more feeder and cow-calf oriented, you will see things of beef prices. You will see discussion of cattle and feed reports and stuff. This is free if you want to sign up. I'd love to do that with you. The URL is ridiculously long, or I would have it up here for you, but it's not. So if you're interested in this, just shoot me an email and I'll send you the link to sign up for this. We send this out typically on Monday afternoons with an exception here and there for holidays, but it's a very simple, typically 3 to 6 paragraph market update with some charts and tables every month. This is my contact info. Feel free to reach out to me. I've got my phone number up here, my email. If any of you are on Twitter, I'm not super active. I tweet charts and stuff here and there and simple analysis, but follow me on Twitter at KYCattleEcon. Again, I definitely want to thank Garth and Stan for the invite. I've enjoyed visiting with you. I'm going to look forward to having a little bit of dialogue here, hopefully, if there's been some questions come through. So I will stop sharing and hand it back over to you gentlemen.
No, thank you, Kenny. Certainly a lot to process and think about there. If anybody's got some questions, feel free to type those in. We've got a couple here from one of our extension colleagues. The first question, you started off sharing some Kentucky numbers, and I guess the question is, why are some of those numbers hard to find for Ohio? Who does that tracking and compiling of that data?
Well, so I apologize if I worded that inappropriately. I do apologize. But so naturally, when I was pulling this together, what I have access to is Kentucky prices. And I went to the AMS site where I can get auction data for other states because I wanted to just get some sort of frame of reference. How do Kentucky prices compare to Ohio? And I didn't see anything listed. So if you've got any insight on that, Garth, I'm not going to say I spent hours and hours digging, but I didn't see anything listed there on I didn't see anything listed there on the AMS site, Garth, is why I made that comment.
Yeah, I don't know that we have any markets that report to AMS.
Okay.
I've tried it myself, trying to track weekly market reports, for cull cows and, feeder cattle with certain weight. A lot of times we get to points of the year where there's no test for a given market. So it makes some really ugly graphs and data to share.
Let me add this by all means. I mean, I'm happy to do what I can to help you in any way. So if you want to sign up for the newsletter, we absolutely track prices as best we can in there. And there's multiple states, not Ohio, but there's definitely, surrounding states. And if you've got a need for price data that I can help you with Kentucky wise, I don't mind at all if you reach out to me. I'm happy to do that for you anytime. So yeah, sorry.
Yep. Oh, good stuff. Another question, in relation to some of them small frame feeders, I think it's more of a question on how to add value, maybe in some of that direct marketing opportunities.
Yeah, I think I understand the question, and let me pull it up here real quick because I don't want to. So Christina, if I misunderstand your question, feel free to resubmit it. I'm going to answer it two ways because I think there's two ways I could interpret it. I've always been surprised how many of my larger operations that really are geared towards commodity marketing also have a freezer beef program. And when I talk to them about it, and start asking questions, they tell me just what I think you're asking me. Is they say, well, what happens, I've always got some small frame cattle that I can't get in this load. And they're going to sell as singles or smaller, they're going to get docked at the yards. So I sell them as freezer beef instead. And its bottom line is they're adding value to them because they simply don't fit with the others. So from that perspective, I think it absolutely makes sense. Now, if your question is more about a grass operation in general, so I play farmer myself with a colleague and friend of mine. We're small scale, but we actually do finish cattle on grass and enjoy doing that. I love to watch cattle graze, and we actually don't target small frame cattle. And the reason why is we have basically two main types of markets. We sell freezer beef ourselves, okay, to some customers. Then we have kind of what I'm going to call as a wholesale market. So, we have some folks that basically buy our grass-fed cattle, and then they resell the meat themselves. And frankly, in both cases, we're paid based on pounds. We're paid based on carcass weight freezer beef, and we're paid either based on carcass weight or live weight when we sell wholesale. So we actually don't target smaller framed animals for our freezer beef program because we ultimately are paid on pounds. Another reason why I think some folks do that is because they try to market to folks that have limited freezer space. So I guess, there's an advantage there about smaller frame animals when you've got limited freezer space. But for what we do, actually, I'll take the pounds and I'll just sell quarters instead of halves. That's kind of our philosophy. So that's a good question, Christine. Thank you.
Thanks, Christine. If anybody else has questions, feel free to type them in. Stan, I know you got maybe a more philosophical question you want to ask Kenny.
Yeah, Kenny, I guess, have you got any thoughts, or maybe you and your colleague have talked some, what's the new normal for consumers are going to be? I mean, I've spent 50 plus years of my life going from an environment where we went out to eat once every 2 months on a Sunday after church to where families are eating out or taking out 7 times a week. And now in the last less than a year, we're back to another scenario. And we've got guys in the state, we average about 16 cows, and guys for the first time in their life are thinking about finishing these calves themselves. They've never done it, but they think they can sell freezer beef. We've even got some folks that are talking about building little packing facilities and starting to harvest because they can't get a freezer beef book. Any thoughts on whether this consumer phenomenon that we've experienced in the last 10 months is going to stay when we get back to normal, or how quick is it going to revert back?
That's a great question. And I don't know for sure. I'll give you my 2 cents worth, okay, Stan. Feel free to chime in too if you want, but let's take it in pieces. So first of all, I think let's take the last part first. So you asked about kind of this local demand freezer beef stuff. I think it really started when we absolutely, and we saw at least at bare minimum a decrease in availability of beef at the grocery store level for several weeks there, right? That's what started this whole thing. So one thing that it did do, I think it got a lot of folks foot in the door. Folks that had freezer beef markets already were booked in no time, right? It was just amazing. And got to stop and think here. By the 1st of June, 2020, you could not get an animal processed in Kentucky until 2021, right? So there's no question that's there. We're seeing the same thing you mentioned, by the way. We're seeing some folks wanting to build plants. We have some plants already online. Now they're smaller scale plants, but those are the type that typically work with these kind of operations, right? So I think it really comes down to how well a job we do servicing that market, right? It's a golden opportunity for some folks. It really is. And you're going to see some folks do a really good job, and they're going to build a customer base that's going to stick around. But again, I'm very serious about what I said. I've seen a lot of pictures of finished cattle that I'd be shocked that they weigh 900 pounds. And I have to stop and think, okay, is that consumer coming back? I doubt it, right? So a lot of it comes, I think, to how well we serve that market. The bigger picture question, or I guess the bigger picture spinoff of that question is at the mainstream level. And, I'm like you, we had gotten in the habit too. Part of it was kind of our lifestyle. I was traveling a lot more, pre-COVID. So we went out to eat a whole lot more. But, even me, and I'm someone who, enjoys going out to eat. sometimes. We've gotten very much in the habit of eating at home. And, I've got a quarter beef in my freezer right now. We bought beef when we didn't have so much back in the spring. And I tell you, I just really got to where I just thoroughly enjoyed throwing a nice big steak on the grill and just, spending the afternoon grilling, right? And I say this because I think a lot of this comes back to whatever the consumer response is. And yes, I think food service comes back. I think the sit down type restaurants come back very slowly. I don't think fast food's lost a beat, to be honest with you. Okay. But I think your sit down restaurants are going to come back slowly. I think the challenge really is on the beef sector as a whole. If the new norm is more at home consumption, then we've got to start marketing that way. We've got to convince folks, okay, we got to start pushing these upper end steaks through at home consumption, grilling, and not so much through upper end restaurants. So I think we can adapt either way, but I agree it's going to take a while for things to get back to normal, even when things are quote unquote normal. Sorry for the long answer, Stan.
It's a hard question, and it's been debated for months now. And you just hate to see guys make a commitment to finish cattle or do something they've never done before. And they're saying, is this thing going to change back as soon as we're all vaccinated here in 6 months, or as soon as it goes away? Or is this going to be another very slow progression back to what was normal a year ago? And heck of a debate.
It's a great question. And I don't think it's going to go back immediately by any means. The other thing I would say, folks who are servicing these direct-to-consumer markets, freezer beef markets. So I grew up in feeder cattle country, right? I mean, I'm not used to seeing finished cattle. And although I've been finishing cattle now for 5 or 6 years, it takes a long time to develop an eye for what a finished animal looks like. It's just not natural to me. I'm still not that good at it, frankly. But, so many of us, we just don't really know what a finished animal should look like. So there's a learning curve for consumers as they kind of get used to this. There's a learning curve on the production side as well.
Anybody else have any questions you'd like to address while we've got Kenny available to us? No, here comes something. Christine, has anybody tracked the sales of grills and smokers during COVID?
I'm sorry I haven't. However, I can tell you couldn't find a deep freeze there for several months. So that's related, I think, right? Good question.
Certainly some interesting times.
Yeah, absolutely.
I guess, Kenny, a question that I've dealt with here in the last couple months, and I think you touched on it there briefly. In addition to some preconditioning programs, it seems like all the time here in Ohio, you get more and more guys wanting to feed for these all natural, never ever type programs. Any thoughts on somebody who might be interested in that from the cow-calf side?
Sure, and those are definitely growing. There's been several studies that have kind of looked at that. I did some work, I'm kind of dating myself now, but I did some work back around 2011 or so looking at that. We found about a $4 or so per hundredweight premium, for cattle that were, it was hard to separate, but these were cattle that were both natural and agent source verified. But frankly, you're going to have them go together anyway, right? So about $4 a hundred, and that was through internet sales, which frankly probably are going to be some of your lower value. And that's another way to say it. I guess my point is, if you've got an established market with a certain value added market entity, you could probably do better than that. So I think there's premiums out there. The biggest thing to me is, though, you've got to look at the cost side too. And I mean, by the way, we don't implant our cattle. We are not certified or anything, but we ultimately have a natural program ourselves. But we market in such a way that we're rewarded for that. So you just got to make sure that whatever your premium is, that it's compensating you for the fact that you are absolutely giving up some pounds, right? And you're giving up the ability to deal with some things, that you would not otherwise be able to deal with. So that there is a cost to that, and you've got to have more money to make that work. So there's actually a place for when the market's growing, but don't let a few bucks a hundredweight sway you without really pushing the pencil either.
Yeah, yeah, and I think another piece, whether they're preconditioned calves or calves that fit in them programs, if you're taking them to stockyards and not telling anybody, you know, you got to do some advertising for yourself there to whoever's receiving those cattle.
Let the stockyards know that when you're coming and what you've got, and how many you got, right? What you don't want is you don't want to be the only person that has cattle of that type there that day unless you got a potload, right? They may even say, you know what, why don't you bring them next week? I think such and such is bringing some that might go with them. That may be the best market advice you can get is you simply get them there on a day when there's other cattle like that on the same day.
Yeah, better opportunity to pull calves, and if our producers can't make pot loads, at least give those order buyers the opportunity, and maybe add $1 or $2 here and there. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions, and we're approaching 8 o'clock. Once again, if you're interested, we've got 4 more weeks of virtual cow-calf school coming up Monday evenings. We got a cattle feeding webinar, talk more about some risk management and some feedlot ventilation topics coming up here February 24th. And once again, look for that program survey. Certainly appreciate any responses we get there. Kenny, certainly appreciate taking time to present to some Buckeyes. And
well, thanks for the invite. I enjoyed doing it and enjoyed getting to work with you a little bit. I got to do a program for the dairy folks back in November, so I've always enjoyed getting to cross the state line. Although I guess it's been virtual this time, but thanks for the invite and wish everybody the very best.
Thank you.